They never warned you that some battles begin long before you are born, that some wounds arrive without your permission, wrapped in traditions, habits, and quiet expectations. You grow up believing this is just how family is, never realizing you are carrying emotional debts you did not create. You inherit reactions instead of reasons, silence instead of safety, and patterns that shape your choices before you even understand them. What makes these struggles dangerous is not their intensity, but their invisibility. No one calls them out. No one names them. They pass through generations disguised as love, discipline, and concern. And because they feel familiar, you defend them, you excuse them, you build your identity around surviving them rather than questioning them. But there comes a moment, often in exhaustion, confusion, or quiet loneliness, when you sense something is wrong. Not with you, but with what you were taught to accept. This is not rebellion, this is awakening. Because the moment you recognize what you inherited without consent is the moment you reclaim the power to end it. The silent inheritance. There are things you inherit that no one ever explains. They don't come with stories told at family gatherings or lessons passed down with pride. They arrive quietly, almost invisibly, woven into everyday life. You inherit the way silence is used as an answer. You inherit the tension in a room when certain topics surface. You inherit the habit of watching faces before speaking, measuring words before expressing feelings. Long before you learn who you are trained in how to behave, how to adapt, how to survive. This inheritance does not feel forced because it begins before awareness. It feels normal, and that is precisely why it stays. The silent inheritance is not about what was done to you openly, but about what was never addressed. It lives in the pauses, the avoided conversations, the emotions that were redirected instead of understood. You watched how disappointment was handled, how anger was suppressed or released, how vulnerability was rewarded or dismissed. No one sat you down and said, "This is how you should feel," yet you learned exactly which feelings were acceptable and which ones made the environment uncomfortable. Over time, you didn't just observe these patterns, you absorbed them. They became instinct. They became automatic responses you stopped questioning. As a child, you adapt because you must. You learn quickly that belonging often depends on adjustment. If expressing yourself creates tension, you soften. If honesty brings distance, you choose silence. If strength is praised only when it looks like endurance, you teach yourself to endure. This is not weakness, it is intelligence shaped by necessity. But what protected you once can quietly imprison you later. The tragedy of the silent inheritance is that it trains capable, thoughtful individuals to doubt their own perceptions. You feel something is wrong, yet you hesitate to trust that feeling because it contradicts what you were shown to accept. This inheritance follows you into adulthood, disguised as personality. You call it being low maintenance, easygoing, or emotionally strong. But beneath those labels is often a deep unfamiliarity with your own needs. You struggle to name what hurts because you were never given the language for it. You feel responsible for harmony even when it costs you peace. You replay situations in your mind, wondering if you are overreacting, because you were raised to believe that discomfort should be tolerated rather than explored. The demon here is not cruelty or intention, it is repetition without awareness. What makes the silent inheritance so powerful is that it doesn't demand obedience through fear, but through familiarity. You defend what shaped you because it feels like home, even when it limits you. You excuse patterns because that's just how things were. You hesitate to examine them because doing so feels like betrayal. But awareness is not accusation. Understanding where something came from does not mean condemning those who passed it on. Many of them were carrying the same inheritance handed down without instruction or healing. The cycle continued not because of malice, but because no one paused long enough to question it. There comes a moment, however, when familiarity stops feeling safe, when the cost of carrying what was never yours becomes too heavy to ignore. It may show up as emotional exhaustion, repeated relationship struggles, or a quiet sense of disconnection from yourself. This is not failure. This is your awareness trying to speak after years of being silenced. The silent inheritance begins to lose its power the moment it is seen clearly, not dramatized, not denied, simply acknowledged for what it is. Breaking this pattern does not require confrontation or chaos. It begins internally, with permission, permission to feel without explanation, permission to pause before reacting, permission to separate who you are from what you were taught to be. You start noticing when your responses belong to the present and when they are echoes of the past. You learn to sit with discomfort instead of immediately managing it away. This is slow work, quiet work, but it is profound. When you recognize the silent inheritance, you are no longer bound to repeat it. You become the point where unconscious patterns meet conscious choice. You may still feel their pull, but you are no longer owned by them, and in that awareness, something shifts, not just for you, but for everyone who comes after. Because the most powerful inheritance is not perfection or obedience, it is clarity, and clarity ends cycles that silence could never heal. Loyalty that teaches you to betray yourself. Loyalty is often praised as one of the highest virtues in a family. From an early age, you are taught that standing by your own is a moral duty, that unity must be protected at all costs, and that questioning those closest to you is a sign of ingratitude. But there is a quiet distortion that can take place when loyalty is defined without balance, when it is framed not as mutual care, but as unquestioning compliance. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, loyalty stops being about connection and starts becoming about control. And the most painful part is that it trains you to turn against yourself while believing you are doing the right thing. This kind of loyalty does not announce itself as harmful. It is introduced as respect, as patience, as maturity. You are encouraged to understand behavior that consistently dismisses your emotional reality. You are praised for staying calm when something hurts you, for not making things difficult, for being the one who holds everything together. Over time, you learn that your role is not to express, but to absorb, not to question, but to endure. You become skilled at explaining away discomfort, convincing yourself that your feelings are less important than maintaining order. As this pattern deepens, a subtle betrayal begins. You start to override your instincts. When something feels wrong, you tell yourself you are being sensitive. When boundaries feel necessary, you talk yourself out of them. You confuse self-sacrifice with strength and silence with wisdom. This betrayal is not dramatic, it is quiet and constant. Each time you ignore your inner voice to preserve external peace, you reinforce the belief that your needs are negotiable, optional, or inconvenient. And eventually, you forget that loyalty was never meant to erase you. In adulthood, this learned loyalty follows you into every relationship. You tolerate imbalance longer than you should. You give more than you receive and call it commitment. You feel guilty for wanting fairness because you were taught that asking for too much is selfish. Even when you are exhausted, you hesitate to step back because withdrawal feels like abandonment. You carry a deep sense of responsibility for other people's comfort while feeling uneasy about your own. This is how loyalty, when misused, becomes a lifelong pattern of self-neglect. What makes this dynamic difficult to confront is the fear attached to it, the fear of being seen as disloyal, the fear of disappointing those whose approval once felt essential to survival, the fear that asserting yourself will fracture bonds beyond repair. But true loyalty does not require fear to function. It does not demand silence to survive. It allows space for honesty, growth, and mutual accountability. When loyalty is healthy, it strengthens both sides. When it is distorted, it survives only by shrinking one person to keep the structure intact. Recognizing this form of loyalty can feel deeply uncomfortable because it challenges identities you may have built your self-worth around. You may have been the understanding one, the strong one, the peacekeeper. Letting go of that role can feel like losing purpose. But roles assigned by survival are not identities. They are strategies. And strategies are meant to evolve when circumstances change. You are not dishonoring your past by outgrowing it. You are honoring the part of yourself that endured it. Reclaiming yourself does not mean abandoning others. It means redefining loyalty so it includes you. It means allowing your feelings to carry weight, your limits to be respected, and your voice to exist without apology. This shift may feel unfamiliar, even unsettling, because it breaks a long-held internal contract. But with time, it brings a deeper, steadier form of connection, one built on presence rather than sacrifice. When loyalty no longer demands that you disappear, it transforms from a burden into a bond. And in that transformation, you end a pattern that taught generations to confuse love with self-erasure. You become loyal not just to where you came from, but to who you are becoming, and that is the kind of loyalty that heals instead of harms. Emotional rules you were never allowed to break. Every family has rules, but some of the most powerful ones are never spoken. They are not written down, yet they are enforced with precision. You learn them not through explanation, but through reaction. A look that shuts you down, a change in tone that signals you've gone too far, a silence that lingers just long enough to teach you a lesson. Over time, you understand exactly where the invisible lines are drawn. What can be said, what must be softened, what should never be mentioned at all. These emotional rules shape you long before you realize they exist. As a child, breaking these rules carries a cost. It might be withdrawal, discomfort, or the feeling that you have disrupted something fragile. So you adapt. You adjust your emotional range to fit the environment. If sadness makes others uneasy, you hide it. If anger is unwelcome, you swallow it. If curiosity feels threatening, you learn to stay quiet. This adaptation is not a flaw, it is survival. But when emotional expression is managed through restriction rather than understanding, the child learns a dangerous lesson. Feelings are problems to be controlled, not signals to be explored. These rules follow you into adulthood, quietly influencing how you relate to yourself and others. You hesitate before expressing discomfort, instinctively scanning for approval. You feel anxious when emotions rise, even when they are justified. You may struggle to ask for support because you were taught implicitly that emotional needs create inconvenience. Instead of trusting your feelings, you evaluate them, asking whether they are acceptable, reasonable, or allowed. This internal negotiation becomes exhausting, yet it feels normal because it has always been there. The real damage of unspoken emotional rules is not emotional suppression alone, but emotional confusion. When feelings are consistently discouraged or minimized, you lose clarity about them. You sense something is wrong, but you cannot name it. You feel overwhelmed, yet you cannot explain why. Emotions that were never given space do not disappear, they collect beneath the surface. Over time, they emerge as chronic tension, sudden emotional shutdown, or a constant sense of being on edge. The rules did not teach you emotional strength, they taught you emotional avoidance. What makes these rules difficult to challenge is the guilt attached to breaking them. Even as an adult, expressing your truth can feel like you are doing something wrong. You may fear being seen as dramatic, ungrateful, or disruptive. This fear is not a reflection of reality, it is a conditioned response. Your nervous system learned early that emotional expression led to discomfort, and it still reacts as if the same consequences apply. But adulthood offers something childhood did not: choice. And with choice comes the possibility of change. Learning to break these rules is not about emotional outbursts or confrontation. It begins with permission, permission to feel without judgment, to experience emotions without immediately trying to justify or suppress them. It means allowing sadness to exist without rushing to fix it, and allowing anger to inform you without letting it consume you. This process can feel unfamiliar and even unsettling because you are stepping outside a structure that once kept you safe. But safety built on restriction eventually becomes limitation. As you slowly unlearn these rules, you start to experience a different relationship with yourself. Emotions become information rather than threats. You begin to trust your internal signals instead of questioning their legitimacy. You notice that expressing yourself honestly does not automatically lead to collapse or rejection. In fact, it often leads to clarity about what you need, what you value, and where boundaries are required. Emotional freedom does not mean chaos, it means alignment. Breaking inherited emotional rules is a quiet act of courage. It does not erase your past, nor does it invalidate what others went through. It simply acknowledges that what once helped you survive no longer needs to define how you live. When you allow yourself to feel fully and speak carefully but honestly, you end a cycle of emotional confinement, and in doing so, you give yourself something that was never explicitly granted before: the right to exist emotionally without permission, the normalization of emotional distance. Emotional distance rarely begins as a choice, it begins as an adjustment. When warmth is inconsistent, when affection is unpredictable, or when closeness feels conditional, the mind adapts in the only way it knows how: by pulling back. You learn not to expect too much, not to reach too far, not to need too openly. Over time, this distance stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like personality. You tell yourself you are independent, self-contained, strong, but what you really learned was how to survive without reliable emotional presence. In environments where connection is uncertain, closeness can feel risky. You may have learned that being open invites disappointment, or that expressing need leads to discomfort rather than care. So you become careful with your emotions. You share selectively. You keep conversations safe. You maintain composure even when something inside you longs for understanding. This is not coldness, it is conditioning. Emotional distance becomes the shield that protects you from the confusion of unmet expectations. As this pattern settles in, it reshapes how you relate to others. You may appear calm and composed, yet struggle to feel deeply connected. You can listen well, offer support, and remain present. But when it comes to being seen yourself, there is hesitation. Vulnerability feels unfamiliar, even unsafe. You may value relationships, yet feel oddly alone within them. This distance is not a lack of care. It is the result of learning that closeness does not always lead to security. What makes emotional distance difficult to recognize is how socially acceptable it can be. It is often praised as strength, maturity, or emotional control. You are seen as grounded, resilient, unbothered. Few people notice the quiet cost, the muted joy, the restrained affection, the constant self-monitoring. When emotional distance becomes normal, you stop asking for what you need because you stop believing it will be met. You settle into self-reliance not because it fulfills you, but because it feels safer than hope. Over time, this distancing can create an internal conflict. Part of you desires connection, depth, and warmth. Another part stays alert, prepared to withdraw at the first sign of disappointment. This push and pull can be exhausting. You may find yourself longing for closeness while simultaneously avoiding it. When someone gets too near, you feel the urge to retreat, not because they have done something wrong, but because intimacy awakens old uncertainty. The distance that once protected you now limits you. Relearning closeness is not about forcing vulnerability or abandoning caution. It is about gently questioning the belief that distance equals safety. It begins with noticing when you withdraw automatically and asking whether the present moment truly requires it. It involves allowing small, manageable moments of openness and observing the outcome. This process requires patience because your nervous system learned these patterns over many years. Trust cannot be rushed when it was once unreliable. As you slowly reduce emotional distance, you may feel discomfort. Not because something is wrong, but because something is different. Being seen can feel unfamiliar. Receiving care may feel awkward. Accepting support may challenge the identity you built around self-sufficiency. But these feelings are signs of growth, not weakness. They indicate that you are expanding beyond the limits set by earlier experiences. When emotional distance is no longer your default, connection becomes less threatening and more nourishing. You begin to experience relationships as places of mutual presence rather than careful management. You learn that closeness does not require the loss of control, and that warmth does not have to be earned through restraint. In choosing to gently step closer instead of retreating, you break a cycle that taught generations to survive apart rather than heal together, ending the bloodline of silence. Every cycle continues for one reason: silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the silence that avoids, excuses, and endures without understanding. This silence does not come from weakness, it comes from habit, from generations learning that certain things are better left unsaid, that naming pain disrupts order, and that survival depends on not asking difficult questions. Over time, silence becomes tradition, and what is repeated long enough begins to feel unquestionable. The bloodline of silence teaches you to carry what was never resolved. You inherit unfinished conversations, unacknowledged emotions, and lessons shaped by avoidance rather than clarity. You sense tension without context and responsibility without explanation. You learn early that keeping things contained is safer than bringing them into the open, so you become careful with your words, selective with your truth, and skilled at enduring discomfort quietly. This skill may earn praise, but it also builds a life where authenticity feels risky. As an adult, this silence often shows up internally. You struggle to articulate what you feel, even to yourself. You minimize your experiences because others had it harder. You hesitate to seek understanding because you were taught that speaking up creates problems. This internalized silence can be more limiting than any external rule. It keeps you stuck in patterns you can sense but cannot fully explain. You feel the weight of something inherited, yet you lack the language to name it. Ending the bloodline of silence does not require public declarations or dramatic confrontations. It begins with honesty, quiet, deliberate honesty. Honesty with yourself about what affected you, even if it was subtle. Honesty about what you are still carrying, even if no one meant to pass it on. This kind of truth does not assign blame, it creates understanding. And understanding is what silence has prevented for generations. Breaking silence can feel uncomfortable because it challenges long-standing emotional agreements. You may fear being misunderstood, dismissed, or seen as disruptive. These fears are echoes of an environment where expression came with consequences. But adulthood offers a different reality. You now have the capacity to choose when, how, and with whom you speak. Silence is no longer your only option. Discernment replaces suppression. Thoughtful expression replaces quiet endurance. As you practice naming your experiences, whether through reflection, conversation, or creative expression, you begin to loosen the grip of what was inherited. What once felt heavy and confusing starts to make sense. You see how certain behaviors were shaped, not chosen. This clarity does not erase the past, but it changes your relationship with it. You stop carrying stories that were never yours to live out. When one person chooses awareness over avoidance, the cycle shifts. You may still feel the pull of old patterns, but they no longer control you. You become the point where silence ends and understanding begins. And that is how cycles are broken. Not through anger, not through denial, but through conscious presence. Ending the bloodline of silence is an act of quiet leadership. It does not demand recognition, but it creates freedom. Freedom to feel, to speak, to choose differently. And in that freedom, you give future generations something rare and powerful. Not perfection, but clarity. Not silence, but truth.